The first presidential debate between President Donald Trump and Democratic nominee Joe Biden was more of a yelling match than a structured exchange of ideas. Here's bringing you the good, bad and ugly of US election on our weekly special WION-VOA Co-Production. Hello and a very warm welcome. I'm Akanksha Swaroop. Now, debate organizers in the United States say they are working on changes to ensure a more productive discussion for the next encounter of the candidates. But analysts say the chaotic outcome of their first meeting is also a reflection of the country's deep political polarization. Voice of America's White House correspondent Patsy Widakuswara brings you this report.
Social media exploded with memes during the first presidential debate between President Donald Trump and Democratic nominee Joe Biden, with many viewers characterizing it as childish and as old men yelling at each other.
This is a left-wing problem. This is radical left.
Will you shut up, man?
There were plenty of personal insults.
There's nothing smart about you, Joe. 47 years, you've done nothing.
You're the worst president America has ever had.
Hey,
Come
Joe,
on.
The kinds of things that we saw last night in the debate are exactly the kinds of things that erode democracy, that in fact our democracy is at risk. And you can tell by the way that political leaders talk to one another.
Discussions about the pandemic, economic recovery and racial unrest were drowned out by insults and interruptions, and shocking moments such as when the president refused to denounce white supremacists.
Who would you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and right
Proud
Boys.
Boys, stand back and stand by.
Our streets! Our streets! Our streets!
Proud Boys, a far-right group that engages in political violence, celebrated the president's remarks and created online memes with his answer. On Wednesday, Trump said he does not know who they are.
Over 200,000 dead, 14 million jobs lost, and Donald Trump spent an entire debate blaming others.
The Biden campaign launched a post-debate digital ad blitz highlighting Trump's remarks, while the Trump campaign claimed that the moderator and the media treated Trump unfairly in the debate and that Biden is weak.
Joe Biden, who was put on his heels most of the time, spent a lot of time looking around for assistance from the moderator and sort of looking around for someone to bail him out.
Initial polls show that the chaotic debate did little to sway voters.
It was very disappointing for American democracy and the country as a whole. It was embarrassing, to be honest with you.
As campaigning enters its final weeks, both campaigns are trying to find voters they can still win over in the key swing states seen as most likely to affect the results. The remaining 2 presidential debates and 1 vice presidential debate are scheduled in October. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News.
Clearly, the tone and tenor of the presidential debate has been the high topic of discussion. But unfortunately, with the US president now testing positive for the coronavirus, a lot could change. Let's get in a sense of perspective from ground zero. Let me quickly go across to Voice of America's Nova Parvati, who joins me live from Washington, D.C. at this hour. Hey, Nova, hope you're doing great.
Thank you.
Nova, now just days after the debate, it's been revealed that President Trump has contracted COVID-19. How is this likely to impact the rest of the election race?
Well, Akanksha, I did say that there's a tradition. Last time we saw each other, there's a tradition in the U.S. Political calendar of an October surprise. No one expected the surprise to come on October 1st.
Yes.
This was certainly a lot of people were unprepared for this. And whether or not the debates would go on, or at least the next presidential debates, is still up in the air. That debate is scheduled for October 15th in the city of Miami. Now, that still is within the 2-week or 14-day self-quarantine for COVID. So we don't know yet whether that puts it certainly up in the air. And this also puts the rest of the schedule for the elections in question as well. And it certainly upends the Trump campaign's efforts to narrow the gap in some states, to flip flip support in other states, and also to basically use the remaining 30 or so days to gain new voters. Now, President Trump was scheduled to go to Florida on Friday, and on Saturday he was scheduled to go to Wisconsin. Wisconsin now swings, according to the polls, more towards Joe Biden, whereas Florida is still a toss-up at this moment. He was also scheduled to go to Arizona, which is also a toss-up, on Monday. So these things are now off the agenda, and this certainly upends his campaign.
Right.
But of course, it also makes the news cycle focus on him now. So we don't know whether what's going to happen in the next few days, Akansha.
It's interesting that you mentioned that it's also going to have the news cycle focus on Trump as well. Having said that, Nova, interestingly, India was also mentioned during the debate with regards to COVID-19 and the new Green Deal. Foreign policy has not seemed to be a major issue so far in the debates, is it?
Well, no, foreign policy doesn't seem to be an issue in the debates, and we also saw that in the political conventions. It was only sometimes mentioned, including in President Trump's decision to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, highlighted by a speech by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo from Jerusalem. And, it's only briefly mentioned. India was mentioned twice, unfortunately rather disparagingly in terms of the COVID numbers, and also with regards to emissions. Basically, the president was saying that other countries, China, India, and Russia, aren't really forthright, both in terms of COVID numbers and also perhaps in emissions. This is, of course, reflects the voters, and outside of wartime, foreign policy usually takes a back seat. And the most recent Pew Research Center poll basically says that most voters think that foreign policy doesn't even hit the top 5 top issues that determine their vote. And this it seems to be the case as well across the board, whether independent, Democrat, or Republican. Now, the issue of foreign policy, whether or not it's an issue for voters, is of course something that has to be dealt with by the president, whoever the president is, come January during the inauguration. And one looming thing is, of course, the relationship with China. Neither Joe Biden nor Donald Trump can evade having to deal with rising China. And this has been a long time coming. We saw terms like Cold War II or the new Cold War during the UN General Assembly as general debate not far ago. And this is something that is a bipartisan concern. So any president, whether Democratic or Republican, would have to deal with the rise of China, and we saw this in the technology field as well. America still bars Huawei, and also there's always a TikTok that's been banned in India is also in the crosshairs of the Trump administration for security concerns. Now, these are things that perhaps affect India as well, because if there is Cold War II, then other countries are forced to choose, at least for the internet, what they're going to do, who they're going to side with. And in terms of swaying voters, I know a lot of talk has been about undecided voters, but how many undecideds are there now? Because a recent poll by NBC News and Wall Street Journal put it at 11%, which is roughly the same as 2016. But another poll by the Quinnipiac University puts it at 3%. And another factor is a lot of states have now begun early voting. Pennsylvania, Illinois, in Washington, D.C., we've already received our ballots, to participate in the elections. So, whatever happens in the next 30 or so days, a lot of people have made up their minds, and a lot of people have already voted, Akansha.
Also, it's almost ironical that foreign policy doesn't seem to have featured in the debate so far, because that's something that Donald Trump has been tom-tomming about for very long. We're going to be talking a lot more about the remaining campaign. For now, let's also talk about how polarized this entire campaign has been. The first presidential debate pitting President Donald Trump against former Democratic Vice President Joe Biden took place in Cleveland, Ohio. The election campaign was combative and has been combative so far, both nationally and in Ohio, a swing state where voters' opinions about the two candidates differ sharply from one household to the next. Voice of America's Carolyn Presutti reports on the deep political polarization, pitting neighbor against neighbor and even family members against family members.
This Trump flag was the first sign of politics in this Ohio neighborhood.
I debated whether to put it up or not because I was afraid my house might get shot at. And then I thought, you know what, I'm not living in fear.
But then, across the street, a Biden supporter, a friend of 44 years.
Whoever is going to be in charge just needs to lead us and be nice and smart and democratic.
Yeah, I hope the best man wins.
I didn't think they were going to do well.
Ohio is a crucial state. No Republican has ever won the presidency without winning Ohio. President Trump won the state by 8 points in 2016. But this year, polls show only a few points separating him from Democratic challenger Joe Biden, as neighbors and sometimes families split their allegiance.
Half of my kids are Trump supporters, so we don't invite them over anymore. No. No. They can't come over until next year. So, you know what I mean? So we say we aren't going to talk about politics, even though we do, and then we stop it.
Across the country, polarization of Trump and Biden supporters can deeply affect families. Case Western Reserve's Joe White teaches American politics and the presidency.
Republicans are more upset about the possibility of their child marrying a person of the same gender or who is transgender. Democrats are much more upset about the idea of their child marrying a Republican.
I'm going to get a wheel put riding with Biden, too. I think I'm going to decorate the whole front lawn. No.
How about hiding with Biden?
Dolores Gentili says her friendship with Patty Lucci rises above politics.
I like Trump. They like Biden. So what? One of them's going to win.
Carolyn Presutti, VOA News, Cleveland, Ohio.
To talk more about the polarization among U.S. voters, let's quickly go back to Voice of America's Nova Purwadi, who's joining us live from Washington, D.C. in this hour. Nova, those lifelong friends with different political views in the story earlier, is that becoming increasingly rare ahead of the election?
Well, yes, it is becoming increasingly rare for someone to tolerate other people's views. There seems to be an existential threat, as some analysts say, in the opposing view, it seems. And I'm sure this is a phenomenon that's worldwide. In India as well, perhaps between BJP and Congress supporters.
True.
So this has happened. This has happened in repeated election cycles, but seems to have gotten worse since 2016. In 2016, a UCLA survey basically said that half of voters would prefer that their child not marry someone from an opposing party. That was in 2016, and has it gotten worse? Well, we see the polarization in the polls in terms of the issues that separate people, the Democrats from Republicans. One of the biggest divergences is on race relations, because while 6 in 10, according to a recent Harvard survey, say that people of color, Black Americans, minorities face discrimination with police, when you divide this among partisan lines, it's 84% of Democrats who think so, and only 32% of Republicans. Now, the recent development with President Donald Trump and First Lady Melania Trump testing positive for COVID is also played out in this polarization, whereas most Republicans basically wish him and the First Lady a speedy recovery. You see Democrats mocking him for mocking Joe Biden for always wearing a mask. He said in the debate, Joe Biden talks to someone 200 feet away and he wears the biggest mask ever. And they're mocking him for mocking Joe Biden for that. And also some are saying, is this a stunt? Is this a stunt to get perhaps sympathy votes among the Democratic side? So you see this polarization, and it seems to be rather irreconcilable. And it's perhaps a global trend as well as we see in many other countries.
And since you mentioned the global trend, I'd like to ask you, what do you attribute this global trend to? There's much talk about how social media seems to be contributing to this polarization. What's your assessment?
Well, yes, social media seems to be contributing to this, and there was a lot of focus after the 2016 elections on the role of Facebook, the role of Twitter, the role of other social media in skewing discourse, political discourse, campaigning, misinformation, fake news which isn't exactly news you don't like, but is actually misleading news, you know. So there's been a lot of talk on that. And the interesting thing is more and more people get their news from social media these days. A Pew Research Center study recently conducted said that around 18% or 1 in 5 Americans get a majority of their news from social media. This might not seem like much, but what's not shown in the overall numbers is the age distribution of it. Younger voters from 18 to 29, 48%, roughly half, get most of their news on social media. Whereas for 30 to 49-year-olds, it's 40%. Older voters, older Americans don't get their news primarily from social media. 50 to 64-year-olds, only 9% get a majority of their news stories from social media. And the problem with social media, as you know, is anything can be posted, even misinformation. And once it becomes viral, you know, people tend to believe it, even if another fact emerges afterwards to dispute it. And this is a problem in many countries with WhatsApp and everything. And, you know, people just need to perhaps balance out, you know, the social media with people like you and I, Akansha.
Those are some very interesting figures that you shared that also goes on to indicate what social media is doing to election campaigns, and is this US election campaign the new face of what election campaigns are going to look like in times of social media. On that note, thank you so much, Nova, for joining us on this newscast and bringing us all the latest on US election. We'll keep coming back to you every Friday.